The morning at the lake had started in that quiet, glassy way where the water mirrors the sky. I was in my cabin office, coffee in hand, tapping out a few emails before the day got loud. Outside, gulls squabbled over fish scraps from a dock down the shore. The smell of pine and wet earth drifted through the cracked window beside me. Everything felt calm, balanced until the sound of heavy footsteps shattered it. Karen was early, which was never good news. I could recognize that sharp, heel-heavy march anywhere. It had a kind of self-importance you could hear before you saw it. Her visits were like small thunderstorms, predictable, loud, and always leaving a mess behind. I sighed and placed my mug down on the desk with a deliberate clink. The last time she'd shown up unannounced, I'd gotten a formal warning about my porch lights being too festive. The record, they were simple white string lights, the same kind half the cabins used year-round. But Karen, in her infinite wisdom, as president of the Cedar Shores HOA, decided they were not. The bylaws were vague, of course written in a way that gave her all the room she needed to interpret them however she pleased. Once, she even cited a neighbor for grass demeanor, a term none of us had ever heard before. Apparently it meant his lawn looked too relaxed. Today's complaint was anyone's guess, though I had a few theories. Maybe it was the new dock chairs I'd set out last week in bright red, Adirondacks that added some badly needed cheer to the shoreline. Or maybe she'd found out about the bonfire we'd hosted with a couple of the fishing guides in town. Karen had a way of treating any fun within her jurisdiction as a personal insult, and my pulse was steady, but there was a tension building in my shoulders all the same. Her shadow crossed the window before she reached the door, blotting out the morning light. I kept my gaze on my computer screen, pretending I didn't notice. She was the kind of person who fed on reactions, so I liked to delay them when possible. But when the door flew open without a knock, the act was over. She stood there, hands on hips, eyes scanning the room like she was searching for contraband. She didn't even bother with a good morning. Instead, her voice came sharp and tight. "We have a situation." That was Karen's way of saying, "I've decided you're in trouble." I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands over my stomach in mock relaxation. "Is that so?" I asked, keeping my tone mild. She was already narrowing her eyes at something over my shoulder. I knew what she was looking at, the stack of folded blankets by the window seat. They were nothing remarkable, just some old wool throws my grandmother had left me. But if Karen wanted to, she could invent a rule about textile colors not matching HOA-approved palettes. She'd done similar before, once accusing a neighbor of visual pollution for painting his shed door a cheerful yellow. I braced myself for whatever absurdity she'd brought today. "This," she said, pointing vaguely toward the dock, "outside is a violation of Section 5, subsection 3. I didn't move to look. I already knew she meant the chairs. "Red is not an approved color for shoreline fixtures," she continued, sounding like a judge delivering a sentence. "You'll need to remove them immediately or face a fine." My eyebrow twitched upward, but I stayed quiet for a beat longer than was comfortable. "You came all the way here to talk about chairs," I finally said. My voice carried just enough incredulity to make her shoulders stiffen. Karen thrived on authority, but she hated when people didn't take her pronouncements seriously. "It's not just chairs," she snapped. "It's about preserving the harmony of our community." That was HOA speak for "I like things the way I like them." While she talked, I couldn't help but think about the irony. So-called harmony she claimed to protect was constantly being disrupted by her own policing. Neighbors avoided her, parties were kept quiet, and even holiday decorations had to pass her inspection. Cedar Shores had started to feel less like a community and more like a kingdom with a single fussy monarch. And right now, that monarch was standing in my office. Dripping disapproval like rain from an eave, I let her go on for a minute, partly to see how far she'd push it. She cited bylaws, referenced precedents, and even hinted at a special board meeting to address my repeated disregard for guidelines. All of it was delivered in that tight, clipped tone that made her sound like a substitute teacher you couldn't wait to escape. Finally, I decided I'd had enough. "Actually, Karen," I said, leaning forward, "there's someone here I'd like you to meet." She paused mid-sentence, clearly not expecting a pivot. Her gaze flicked toward the far side of the room, though from where she stood, she couldn't quite see the seating area beyond the bookshelves. I watched the faintest crease form between her brows, she asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. A friend, I replied lightly, though the word didn't begin to cover it. For a moment, I considered just letting her stew in that curiosity. But something about the sheer confidence she'd walked in with made me want to flip the script. Quickly, come on, I said, standing and gesturing toward the other side of the office. My chair creaked as I pushed it back, the sound loud in the otherwise quiet cabin. Karen hesitated, then took a slow step forward, still clutching her clipboard like a shield. Her shoes clicked against the wood floor. Each step measured, like she was bracing for some kind of trap. In truth, she wasn't far off. The governor had arrived earlier that morning, unannounced but welcome, asking if he could use my quiet cabin to prepare for an upcoming speech in town. I'd known him for years. He'd once been my fishing buddy. Before politics swallowed his free time, he was sitting calmly just beyond Karen's line of sight. As we neared the corner of the room, I could see the moment she caught sight of him. Her stride faltered. Her breath hitched almost imperceptibly, and her fingers tightened on the clipboard. The governor looked up from the papers in his lap, meeting her gaze with a mild, polite expression. "Good morning," he said in that even voice that could calm a room or unsettle it depending on the situation. Karen's lips parted, but no words came out immediately. The authority she'd carried like armor seemed to slip a notch. She straightened, smoothed the front of her blouse, and forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Governor," she said finally, her voice pitched awkwardly between greeting and apology. He nodded, waiting for her to continue. I stayed silent, letting the awkwardness bloom in the space between them. For once, Karen didn't seem to have a prepared script. Her eyes darted from the governor to me and back again, like she was recalculating her position entirely. It was the first time I'd seen her unsure of herself, and I'll admit it was satisfying. Still, the real fun was only just beginning. Karen cleared her throat, a small sound that carried more strain than she probably meant. I didn't realize. "You were visiting," she said, each word measured as though she was testing for landmines. The governor's smile was faint, but unmistakably amused. "Just enjoying the lake," he replied. His calm tone made the room feel even smaller for her. She tried to recover, adjusting her stance and pulling the clipboard against her chest like a lifeline. "Well, I was just here to address a minor community matter," she explained. It was the first time I'd ever heard her use the word minor about anything involving me. Her usual grave violations had been downgraded to a gentle suggestion in the span of 10 seconds. The governor raised one eyebrow, waiting for more. Karen's eyes flitted back toward the window, maybe to the infamous red chairs. "There's a small, aesthetic concern," she began, her voice trailing like a kite with no wind. The governor tilted his head slightly. "Aesthetic," he repeated as though he found the term fascinating. She nodded quickly, but didn't dare elaborate. "It's not urgent," she added, a phrase I was sure she'd never spoken before. I almost felt bad for her. The governor said, setting his papers aside. "I'm sure we can find a way to keep the community beautiful without interrupting someone's mourning." His tone was smooth, but the subtext was clear. "This conversation is over." Karen's smile tightened another fraction, and she shifted her weight as though preparing to retreat. I leaned against the bookshelf, watching the tension drain from her posture. It struck me then how quickly the balance of power in a room could change. Just minutes ago, she had walked in like a storm front, certain she would bend me to her will. Now, with a single polite greeting from the governor, she was recalculating every move. The air seemed lighter, even though she hadn't yet left. Coffee, cooling on the desk behind me, suddenly seemed like the perfect victory toast. Karen finally lowered the clipboard, a gesture that felt almost like surrender. "Perhaps I'll follow up at another time," she murmured. The governor gave a small nod of acknowledgement. "That sounds reasonable," he said, his voice making it sound like a settled matter. I could see the faint flush on her cheeks. As she turned toward the door, she didn't quite meet my eyes on the way out. When the door closed behind her, the silence felt different than before. It wasn't just the absence of her voice. It was the absence of the tension she always carried. "In with her?" The governor chuckled softly, shaking his head. You weren't kidding about her, he said. I grinned, leaning over to retrieve my coffee. And that, I told him, was one of her better moods. He laughed again, the sound low and knowing. Like someone who'd met more than his share of Karens in his time. Well, if she's representative of your HOA, I think you've got your work cut out for you. I nodded, taking a sip of the no lukewarm brew. They're a special bunch, I said. Outside, the gulls had gone quiet, as though even the birds knew the show was over, but something told me Karen wouldn't let it go for long. She wasn't the type to admit defeat gracefully, and the embarrassment of this morning would likely fester. I could already imagine her plotting a way to reclaim the upper hand, probably with a new bylaw, aimed specifically at me. If anything, I was curious to see how far she'd go next. The governor, meanwhile, seemed content to settle back into his papers. Thanks for letting me crash here, he said. Needed somewhere off the radar. I shrugged, waving it off. You're always welcome here, I replied, especially if it keeps Karen. From talking about my chairs, both laughed, though I knew this was only the beginning of the day's entertainment. 2 days passed without a peep from Karen, which was unusual. Normally, she'd follow up a visit with a typed letter on HOA letterhead, slipped under my door like some sort of legal grenade. Half expected her to show up the very next morning, clipboard in hand, ready with new charges. Instead, the quiet stretched long enough to feel suspicious. Peace around here usually meant someone was plotting. Sure enough, on the 3rd day, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. It was stamped urgent in red, as though it contained state secrets rather than petty grievances. Inside was a formal notice of a special community compliance meeting scheduled for Friday evening. The wording dripped with faux professionalism, but I could hear her voice in every sentence. She'd even bolded the part that said mandatory attendance. I laughed out loud when I got to the agenda. Item 1. Addressing recurring aesthetic violations on lakeside properties. Item 2. Consideration of penalties for noncompliance. And Item 3, my personal favorite, community values and the dangers of setting bad examples. Subtlety had never been Karen's strong suit. If this meeting wasn't about me, I'd eat my red dock chairs. I decided not to RSVP just to annoy her. She'd expect me to come storming in with the defense ready, but I preferred to show up cool and unbothered. The governor had already left town, but I suspected his presence still lingered in her mind like a shadow. The embarrassment she'd suffered in my office might have cooled her fury temporarily. Clearly, she'd found her second wind. This was going to be fun. Friday came with heavy gray clouds rolling over the lake, the kind that made the air smell like rain long before it fell. Cedar Shores Community Hall was really just an oversized boathouse with folding chairs, a podium, and a perpetually broken coffee machine. I arrived 5 minutes late on purpose and slipped into a chair near the back. Heads turned. Karen's glare found me instantly. She was already at the podium, dressed in what I could only describe as formal HOA battle gear, a stiff blazer, sensible flats, and a stack of papers gripped like a weapon. We'll now address Item 1 on the agenda, she announced. Her eyes flicked to me as she said it, and several people in the room followed her gaze. The trap was set, and everyone knew it. Karen began her speech, painting a grim picture of what would happen if aesthetic standards were allowed to slip. Property values will plummet, she warned, her tone grave. Our community's image will suffer irreparable damage. It was impressive how she could make a couple of brightly colored chairs sound like a national emergency. I folded my arms and waited for my moment. When she finally invited comments from the concerned party, I didn't move right away. Let her sweat a little, I thought. She repeated the invitation, more pointed this time. Slowly I stood, letting my chair scrape the floor just enough to be heard over the rain starting to tap against the roof. All eyes were on me. Karen's lips pressed into a thin, expectant line. I appreciate the concern for the community. I began, making my voice as smooth and polite as possible. But I'm curious, has anyone actually complained about the chairs? A murmur rippled through the room. Karen opened her mouth, but I raised a hand to stop her. Or I continued, is this about something else entirely? That last line landed like a stone in still water. For the briefest moment, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in her expression. She quickly masked it with indignation. "This is about rules," she said sharply, "and the fact that they apply to everyone equally." I could almost admire her ability to lie without blinking. Almost. A man in the second row coughed into his hand, barely disguising a laugh. The mood in the room was shifting. That was when I decided to push just a little harder. "Interesting," I said, because when the governor was here, he seemed to think the chairs were just fine. The room went utterly still. Even the rain seemed to pause, hanging in the air like it was waiting for the response. Karen's jaw tightened, but she didn't speak right away. She knew she'd walked into dangerous territory, Karen finally found. Her voice, but it came out thinner than usual. "The governor's opinion is irrelevant to HOA guidelines," she said, forcing a laugh that didn't land. The room stayed quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their folding chairs. I could see the crack forming in her control. I wasn't about to let it close. "Of course," I replied, smiling slightly. "But it's worth noting that a very public figure enjoyed his visit here without issue." "That's good for our community's image, isn't it?" Murmurs broke out again, this time with a few nods in my direction. Karen's grip on the podium tightened until her knuckles whitened. She looked like she was holding on to keep from being swept away. One of the older residents, Mrs. Halbrook, spoke up next. "I think the chairs look cheerful," she said plainly. "We could use more of that around here." Small ripple of agreement spread through the crowd. Karen shot her a look, but the damage was already done. This wasn't going the way she'd planned, and she knew it. Karen cleared her throat, flipping her papers as though she could find a page that would save her. "We'll table this discussion for now," she announced abruptly. It was the closest thing to a retreat I'd ever seen her make in public. The meeting moved on to other topics, dock maintenance, a proposed fishing derby, but her attention kept flicking back to me. The war wasn't over, but I'd won this battle. When the meeting adjourned, I lingered by the door, greeting neighbors as they left. Karen avoided eye contact, shuffling her papers into a stiff folder. Just before she stepped outside, she paused as if deciding whether to say something. Whatever it was, she swallowed it and kept walking into the drizzle. I watched her go, certain she was already planning her next strike. The lake air felt fresh. As I left the boathouse, the rain cooling my skin, I knew this small victory wouldn't make her disappear. If anything, it would make her double down. But I also knew she'd underestimated my end. The rest of the neighborhood was starting to see her more clearly. As I walked home, I couldn't help smiling. Karen wasn't done, but neither was I. It started with the white van. No markings, just plain, with a ladder strapped on top, and the kind of rust spots that make you wonder if it's been anywhere legal. I spotted it idling near my dock one Wednesday morning, the driver peering at my shoreline like he was scouting for a break-in. When I stepped outside, he quickly turned away, scribbling something on a clipboard. I had a feeling I knew exactly who had sent him. Sure enough, an hour later, Karen appeared at the edge of my property. She was dressed for battle again, blazer, hair pulled tight, and a smugness that could power the town. "These are inspectors," she announced, gesturing toward the van. "They're here to ensure your property complies with state and local ordinances." I raised an eyebrow.
"Oh.
"Mean HOA ordinances?" I asked. "No," she said, bigger than that. Apparently, she'd decided the HOA wasn't enough firepower. She claimed she'd consulted with municipal officials about my alleged violations. The inspectors, meanwhile, were poking at my dock with what looked like a broom handle. Of them squatted down to peer into the water, frowning like he'd just spotted a corpse. Karen crossed her arms and gave me a look that said, "Checkmate. Mind telling me what this is about?" I asked. Karen pursed her lips. "Dock safety," she said, as though it were obvious. "Structural integrity, environmental impact, shoreline preservation." She listed the charges like a prosecutor on a caffeine high. I let her finish before replying. "You know," I said slowly, "if you'd just asked to sit in the chairs, you could have avoided all this trouble." That earned me a glare, sharp, enough to cut glass. The inspectors, to their credit, didn't seem thrilled to be here. "Looks fine to me," one muttered, tapping the dock planks. The other nodded, jotting something down on his form. Karen's smile faltered just a hair. You'll need to wait for the official report, she said quickly. But I could tell she'd been hoping for a more damning verdict right there on the spot. I offered them coffee, which they politely declined, clearly eager to be anywhere else. As they packed up their gear, Karen lingered like she had more too. Say this isn't over, she warned, her voice low enough that the inspectors couldn't hear. It never is with you, I replied cheerfully. She turned on her heel and marched off, her heels thudding like punctuation marks. The official report arrived 2 days later. It's tucked into my mailbox with the subtlety of a neon sign. Dock structure meets safety and environmental requirements. It read, no violations observed. I laughed so loud the gulls scattered from the shoreline. Not only had she lost again, but now there was paperwork proving it. I thought about framing it right next to the chairs just to rub it in. But then I noticed something at the bottom of the page. Note: suggest repainting dock fixtures to conform with local aesthetic guidelines. It wasn't a requirement. Just a suggestion, but I knew whose fingerprints were all over it. Karen had managed to slip in her obsession with aesthetic harmony, even when the city didn't care. The pettiness was almost impressive. That night, I got a text from my neighbor, Pete. She's holding another board meeting, says it's critical. I could practically hear his eye roll through the phone. I replied with a picture of the inspection report and the caption, bring popcorn. If Karen wanted to keep escalating, I was ready. She didn't realize it yet. But every one of these battles was making her look worse to the whole neighborhood. What she also didn't realize was that I had my own reinforcements on the way. The governor wasn't in town this time, but he'd put me in touch with someone even more effective. A local reporter who loved a good small-town drama. I'd already sent her the inspection report, the HOA notices, and a few choice quotes from neighbors. Karen wanted a war? She was about to get one with an audience. The reporter showed up on a bright Saturday morning, the kind that made the lake sparkle like it was auditioning for a postcard. Her name was Callie, and she carried a notepad in one hand and a camera. Slung over her shoulder? Small-town HOA drama, she said, grinning, is my bread and butter. I liked her immediately. We sat on the dock, yes. The red chairs included and I told her everything. Callie took notes at lightning speed, her pen scratching like it was trying to keep up with gossip at Warp 9. Every so often, she'd glance toward the road clearly, hoping Karen would appear. She will, I assured her. She has a sixth sense for when she's being talked about. Callie laughed, tucking her sunglasses onto her head. She had no idea how right she was, because right on cue, Karen's SUV rolled up, braking hard enough to scatter gravel. She got out wearing a visor and a scowl, the HOA queen prepared for battle. Her eyes landed on Callie, and I swear I could hear her internal alarm go off. And who might you be? She asked, her tone just shy of hostile. Callie smiled sweetly. Local press? Care to comment? The color drained from Karen's face faster than the lake during a drought. Press? About what? She demanded, though her eyes already flicked toward my dock like she knew exactly what. Callie flipped her notepad closed, adopting the look of someone who knew she was holding all the cards. Oh, just a piece on community leadership, she said. The words made Karen straighten like a soldier on inspection. Karen shifted her weight, suddenly aware of the invisible audience that comes with the word press. Well, I'm always happy to talk about our wonderful neighborhood, she began, layering on the charm like frosting on a cake. I stayed quiet, sipping coffee from a mug that said best neighbor ever. Callie let her ramble for a minute before casually asking, and how about the recent dock controversy? That single question landed like a pebble in still water ripples. Spreading immediately, Karen blinked, stammered, then launched into a convoluted explanation about visual cohesion and maintaining the lake's timeless charm. Callie nodded politely, jotting down notes, but I could tell she was already framing the headline in her head. Karen kept talking, each sentence digging her hole a little deeper. Halfway through, Callie asked if she could take a photo. Karen agreed, clearly thinking it would be a flattering portrait of her leadership. Instead, Callie snapped a wide shot of the dock, the red chairs blazing in the sun, with Karen standing stiffly beside them. Perfect, Callie said. I almost felt bad for not warning her. Almost by the time Callie left, Karen's pleasant mask had cracked at the edges. "You think this is funny?" She hissed once the reporter's car disappeared. "Little." I admitted. Her glare could have melted the paint off the chairs, but she didn't say more. Instead, she marched back to her SUV, slamming the door hard enough to echo across the water. The article came out 3 days later with the headline, "Small-town HOA sees big-time disputes over dock decor," the photo of Karen standing next. To the chairs was front and center, her smile so tight it could have been drawn with a ruler. The piece was surprisingly balanced. The reader comments weren't. Let's just say Karen became more than just her name. Neighbors stopped. Me on walks to say they'd read it. Even the postman chuckled when he delivered my mail. Karen, however, was nowhere to be seen for a full week. No surprise visits, no letters, no surprise vans. It was the most peaceful stretch Cedar Shores had seen in months. But peace around. Here never lasts, Anne. I had a feeling the next storm was already forming. It started with an envelope slipped under my cabin door. No stamp, no address, just my name in blocky letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Mandatory compliance notice: remove non-conforming dock fixtures. Within 72 hours, signature at the bottom was Karen's, bold and underlined. She'd bypassed the board, the HOA rules, and common sense entirely. I called Pete to ask if he'd gotten one. "Nope," he said. "Just you. Looks like you're getting the deluxe harassment package." His voice carried that mix of sympathy and disbelief only Karen could inspire. "She can't actually enforce this, can she?" I asked. Pete chuckled. "Not legally, but when has that ever stopped her?" He had a point. So I decided to play along, but on my terms. The next morning I called Callie, the reporter. "Want the sequel?" I asked. She didn't even hesitate. "Always. Bye." The time Karen arrived with her clipboard, Callie was already on the dock, camera ready. "Here to witness compliance," Karen announced, her voice dripping with false authority. I gestured to the chairs, which I'd covered in a massive tarp. Slowly, dramatically, I pulled it away, not to reveal the chairs gone, but freshly painted. In an even brighter, more defiant red, Callie's camera shutter clicked like applause. Karen's jaw actually dropped. "That's not removal," she sputtered. "That's enhancement," I corrected cheerfully. Karen went crimson, matching. "The chairs." "You leave me no choice," she said, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling an emergency meeting." "Good," I said. "I'll bring coffee and the governor's number." That made her freeze mid-dial. Callie caught the moment perfectly. A picture of someone realizing they'd just lost their own game. The emergency meeting ended before it began. Word had spread about Karen's selective enforcement, and most of the board refused to attend. The few who did made it clear they weren't touching the issue again. Karen left in silence, her power eroded in plain view. I almost felt bad. Almost. That evening, I sat on the dock, the red chairs glowing in the sunset. For the first time in months, I felt the tension lift off my shoulders like fog burning away. Karen hadn't apologized. She never would, but her retreat was enough. Across the water, I saw her blinds close. The war was over, at least for now. The envelope was waiting for me like a snake coiled on the floor plane, unmarked and pushed just far enough under my cabin door to be impossible to miss. The handwriting was stiff in all caps, my name carved into the paper as if the pen had been angry. No stamp, no HOA letterhead, nothing official, just the weight of intent. I tore it open with one sharp motion. Inside was a single page that smelled faintly of perfume and rage. The heading screamed in bold type, "Mandatory Compliance Notice." Underneath, it spelled out the alleged offense: remove non-conforming dock fixtures within 72 hours. The words were underlined twice, like she thought repetition could make them legal. And there it was, Karen's signature, oversized and curling at the tail, as if to say, "This is personal." She'd bypassed the board, the process, and reality. I called Pete because in Cedar Shores, no crisis is complete without running it by the neighbor grapevine. "Did you get one of these?" I asked, reading him the notice word for word. "Nope," he said between bites of something crunchy. Sounds like you're on the deluxe harassment package. He paused. You gonna do anything about it? Oh, I'm going to do something, I replied. That night, sat on the dock in one of the infamous red chairs, the lake lapping softly at the posts. The notice lay on the table beside me, weighted down by a mug of coffee I didn't remember. Making 3 days. She thought she could corner me into compliance through sheer pressure. I wondered if she'd planned for the fact that I'm at my most creative when annoyed. The first step was information. I dug out my HOA bylaws to binders thick, printed on paper so dry it practically crumbled in my hands. Not a single clause. Mentioned dock furniture, color restrictions, or even aesthetic cohesion outside of landscaping. In other words, she had nothing, which meant she'd either forged the notice entirely or dressed it up with borrowed legal jargon. By morning, I'd decided to lean into the performance. If Karen wanted drama, I'd give her a full stage production. I called Callie, the reporter, and told her the villain's going for a sequel. She didn't even ask for details, just said, I'll bring my camera. Then I texted Pete to tell him to get his popcorn ready. This time, the audience would be bigger. Karen didn't disappoint. At precisely 10 a.m. the next day, her SUV rolled up with the precision of a military convoy. She emerged in full HOA regalia, blazer, visor, clipboard in hand. I'm here to verify compliance, she announced loudly enough for my seagulls to hear. I could see Pete watching from his porch, phone in hand. He was probably already texting the others. I gestured toward the dock, where a massive tarp concealed my compliance. Kieran marched over, heels clicking against the boards. Callie stood off to the side, camera raised, her smile saying she knew exactly what was about to happen. I grabbed the tarp's edge and gave it a slow, deliberate pull. Underneath, the chairs gleamed freshly repainted in an even more unapologetic shade of red. Karen's jaw moved, but no sound came out for several seconds. That's not removal, she finally managed. That's enhancement, I corrected. Upgraded to meet my personal aesthetic guidelines. Callie's camera shutter clicked, like applause, capturing every second. Pete actually whistled from across the water. Karen's eyes flicked between us, calculating her next move. You leave me no choice, she said finally, pulling out her phone. I'm calling an emergency meeting. Perfect, I replied. I'll bring coffee and the governor's number. That last part made her freeze, her thumb hovering over the dial. Callie caught the exact moment on film, the split second. Hesitation before retreat. She stuffed her phone back into her bag without another word. The emergency meeting was set for that evening. Hosted in the community hall that still smelled faintly of old varnish and lake air. By the time I arrived, a crowd had already gathered half the neighborhood. Leaning against walls or sitting in folding chairs, the board members looked tense, but also vaguely entertained. Karen sat at the front like a judge preparing to sentence. She opened the meeting with a speech about preserving the integrity of Cedar Shores. It was polished, almost rehearsed, with just enough legal language to sound official. But as she talked, I could feel the mood shifting in the room. People exchanged looks, eyebrows lifted, lips twitched. The red chairs had become a symbol, and symbols are harder to kill than furniture. When she finally called for the board to vote on enforcement action, the silence was almost funny. One member cleared his throat and said, I don't think this falls under our jurisdiction. Another mumbled, seems petty, honestly. A third outright refused to vote at all. Karen's eyes darted between them, her composure cracking like thin ice. I didn't say much. I just slid a copy of the inspection report onto the table in front of her, the one stating, my dock met every requirement. For your records, I said. Pete coughed loudly into his fist, though I'm pretty sure it was to cover a laugh. Board moved to close the meeting without a single vote in Karen's favor. It had to sting. Afterward, people lingered outside, chatting in small clusters. Several neighbors came up to me to say they supported keeping the chairs. One elderly man even offered to paint his mailbox the same shade of red for solidarity. Karen, meanwhile, left without speaking, her visor pulled low over her face. Her SUV roared out of the lot like it was fleeing the scene of a crime. Back. At the cabin, I sat in one of the chairs, the lake glowing gold in the sunset. For the first time in months, the air felt light. No vans, no notices, no stomping heels on my dock. Across the water, I saw Karen's blinds twitch, then close. We'd reached a stalemate. The war ended not with a bang, but with a very satisfying fizzle. Of course, I know her too well to think this is the last round. Karen doesn't quit. She regroups. But now, she knows I'll match her move for move on, that the neighborhood's watching. Until then, the chairs will stay bright red. The coffee will stay hot, and I'll keep a tarp handy for dramatic reveals, just in case.